Hello and welcome to Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. My name is Ben and with me as always is...
Jim.
And this week we watched The Adventures of Robin Hood, a 1938 Technicolor classic.
I was not sure how you, and I still don't really know, so we'll find out on this cast. I'm like, how do you feel about being sent back to 1938? It makes me giggle. I'll put it that way.
It's definitely like they still kind of hadn't figured out motion pictures. And that's not a slight on the film. Like, there's narration cards. Like that's like, it's still in that kind of, it's not infancy, but they're toddlers at this stage, right? They're like this is like the golden age of Hollywood. And it shows. It is all of those things in one package of a swashbuckler film, a classic piece of Hollywood. Like, color film wasn't new, but kind of Technicolor was. And like, it was like this big thing of like, hey, we're going to do crazy costumes because you can see all the colors now. And we got to do these elaborate greeneries and all that sort of stuff because you can see the colors now. And, it's amazing for what it is. It is literally a classic, a legend, a piece of influential art that I enjoyed watching. Now, I enjoyed watching it not because of the acting, not because of necessarily the production. I enjoyed watching it as a historical piece. I was engaged throughout the whole thing, and it was more of a wow, like, this is where we've come from. This is where we not started, but this is where we really kicked into gear when it came to like action movies and adventure movies. This is like a prototypical adventure movie, right? Like, this is where we kind of starting to see the evolution from the old black and white epics to kind of these color adventure films. These kind of, look, I don't want to go on too long. I enjoyed the movie. I would watch it again. I would show other people this movie because it has significance. But for a modern audience and for a modern movie watching brain, there's troubles because of pacing, because of title cards. Like, when I went to university for film and television, I had this guy who's like, if you can't show it on the screen, you can't tell it in the story. And when you see a title card putting out like, now we're in Nottingham and Robin Hood has been robbing people for months. Show me Robin Hood robbing people for months. Don't give me a title card. But as I said, they were learning. Those conventions hadn't been set yet. They hadn't fully transitioned to this pure visual medium. And they still had like the title cards from the silent era and all that sort of stuff in these films. But yeah, again, loved it, watched it 1.5 times basically, because I started it and then stopped, and I'm like, well, if I'm going to start it again, I want to watch it from the start, and did. I hadn't seen it. I had seen parts of it, but I had not seen all of it. But yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad because I wasn't sure about that. But look, even though it's Robin Hood, right? Like, so hopefully if you have a pulse, and look, that's not accurate for a modern audience. Like, there are people out there who don't know Robin Hood. However, he is a very popular hero, is all I'm trying to say. So let me do a synopsis of the film, and then we can launch into our facts. So
Yes.
Here we go. Richard is the Norman king of England, and he's captured by Duke Leopold while returning from the Third Crusade. Richard's brother, Prince John, with Sir Guy of Gisborne, names himself regent, increasing Saxon taxes to gather ransom for Richard, supposedly. Normans oppress the Saxons. Sir Robin of Locksley, who is a Saxon noble, rescues the miller's son from execution, which angers Guy of Gisborne. At a Nottingham castle banquet, Robin calls John's regency treason. John orders Robin's execution, but he escapes to Sherwood Forest, where he and his men fight against John and Gisborne. Robin's band, including Little John, Friar Tuck, and Much the Miller, fight injustice by robbing the rich to aid the poor. They capture a convoy of people, humiliating Guy of Gisborne, the Sheriff of Nottingham, and King Richard's ward, Lady Marian. Marian initially scorns Robin, but she's swayed by his charm and his cause. The sheriff proposes an archery tournament to trap Robin. Robin enters, is captured, but he escapes with Marian's help. They then pledge their love, and Marion becomes a spy for them in the castle. King Richard returns to Nottingham disguised, but John learns of his presence and then sends Dickon to kill him. Marion warns Robin, but is caught and then sentenced to death. However, Much the Miller kills Dickon instead of Dickon killing Richard. Richard and his men disguise themselves as monks and are stopped by Robin. Richard reveals his identity and they plan to infiltrate Nottingham Castle together. A melee ensues. Robin kills Guy of Gisborne in a climactic sword fight, frees Marion, and John's men surrender. Richard banishes Robin and restores Robin's titles, commanding him to marry Marion. Robin responds with the famous quote, "May I obey all your commands with equal pleasure, sire." The end. Right?
Fantastic synopsis. Very Jim-styled, very detailed. Quickly to the facts, and then I actually have a point I want to bring up about the story. Anyway, released in 1938, directed by two people, William Keighley and Michael Kurtz. So William Keighley was the beginning director on this, but the studio kind of didn't really have a lot of faith in him directing something this big. He directed 20 studio films. He was also a supervisor in the first motion picture corps in the military in World War II, which is crazy. But Michael Kurtz took over. He had more experience in larger films. He'd recently done Captain Blood, which is another Errol Flynn movie. He also did Casablanca and 1960s Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Oh, excuse me. Sorry.
It's okay. You're allowed to cough. You cough.
Thanks, man. Almost.
You sort yourself out.
My eye flashed. Anyway, okay. So, so basically there was this kind of, it wasn't like a hostile takeover. It was like in the studio system back then, they had contracted directors, they had contracted actors, and it was more of like a shuffle than a hey, you're not good enough. It was like a, hey, just a guy for the role, right? Screenplay by Norman Riley Rain, Seton I. Miller, who actually wrote the script or the story for the original Pete's Dragon, and Roland Lee, who did 1936's The Charge of the Light Horse Brigade, another classic of cinema. Produced by Henry Blank and Hal B. Wallace. Hal B. Wallace was like the Warner Brothers guy. Like, he produced the big uns. He was very influential So back then, producers, actually we're kind of heading back towards that now, were much more involved in their film, especially in the golden age of cinema. They were the ones who brought everyone together. They were the ones who sometimes even came up with the stories that the scripts were written about. And he was this guy, Casablanca, True Grit, The Adventures of Robin Hood, just like really influential in this era of Warner Brothers films. Starring Errol Flynn, Olivia de Havilland, who they both had a storied career together. Like many leading men and leading ladies, they were paired together in multiple films. Basil Rathbone, who played Guy of Gisborne. Claude Rains, who is my favorite person in this film, played Prince John. And Una O'Connor played the maid of Maid Marian, Bess. Budget $3 million, box office $13.4 million, which is pretty big for back then. Like huge, actually, for back then. So them's the facts. A part of this story I didn't know about. So most subsequent Robin Hood stories after this one, I don't think Guy of Gisborne is really a thing. No, it's always the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's sort of Guy of Gisborne is this character who, part of the original, even that's very hard to say because Robin Hood as a story has been through so many different iterations over, centuries now. So, but look, he was definitely, part of that sort of lore of the story. But then, of course, Hollywood just sort of saying, hey, look, we have too many characters here that are basically serving the same function. So why not, reduce, combine, create composite characters, which is why most of his stuff usually ends up just going to the Sheriff of Nottingham, because that kind of makes sense rather than having this surplus of sort of villains here. So
because the Sheriff of Nottingham is almost nothing in this movie. He's a cowardly buffoon. And it's quite odd, really.
Yeah, particularly considering the way we're used to sort of seeing Robin Hood. But look, thank you for those facts. They certainly you dug deep for this one. Like
Well,
It looks like you fell down a little bit of a rabbit hole of the golden age of Hollywood when you were doing your facts. Because
I found it very interesting. Like, I wanted to kind of look into it. I did try to look up stuff on Technicolor. Ooh, that's boring. Um, it's interesting as a technology and what it's done, but the development of it and the iterations it went through. Oh, wow, too much technical knowledge for me. But yeah, no, old actors and actresses and like studio systems fascinate me because they were these kind of like they just don't. It's not like that anymore for obvious reasons. In ways like people would literally be contracted to a single studio for most of their life doing their one thing, whether it was directing, writing, or acting. Writers really got the shaft in this era, especially early on. But even actors, like, you discovered an actor, that was your actor. They weren't
yeah.
an actor for everything. That was their actor. So yeah, I did go a little bit deep. I kind of read everyone's thing and looked into them and that sort of stuff.
It is interesting to me because, like, I do have a fondness for this era of Hollywood movie making. So it was sort of like you were saying. There's something special about the fact that we're only a decade off silent cinema. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like we're so close to that, and this is really the dawn then of what we know as sort of a more modern kind of color process. Now, Technicolor had its time and then it went, but really what they were doing prior to Technicolor was things like tinting the film, and it just wasn't the same as three strip Technicolor, which was really where it was sort of like color has arrived. So it was kind of like if you sort of say, okay, we've been making movies at this point, for 20, 25 years, just as a on the world scene, like that's how new it was. And now, right around now, only now do we have sound happening plus this color process. And I kind of feel like this film and The Wizard of Oz, which hit like literally a year later,
Yeah.
were basically kind of a new dawn of cinema, and it's really a kind of that's the mode that we've existed in then from then on. So I kind of feel like it's a really special time, and obviously just in terms of the genres as well, like Wizard of Oz being a big fantasy movie, this being a huge adventure movie, I'm like, these are like staples of even modern cinema today. That's one of the reasons you go to the movies and you go to see something on the big screen, and this is kind of like the birth of all of that in a way. So I think it's great.
I mean, like we have, and it's kind of died down now, but 3D cinema and surround sound cinema and multi-sensory experience cinema where they blow wind in your hair and cool the cinema and all that sort of stuff. That was color. Color was a feature. Color was an excitement to film. There was a period of time about kind of, the start of color where they literally did the same thing that every technology, oh, it's a fad. It's not going to stick. It's too expensive. All this sort of stuff. And then these people are like, it's not needed for the story. It's never going to be a thing. And then you get this two-strip Technicolor, which is like just using red and green, right? And it was combining tints and things with that. And then and that was additive color, right? They were adding color to the process. And then what I understand of Technicolor was it was a what they call a subtractive process. So they would run 3 reels of film, they would kind of tint them and take color out of them, and then they would put those 3 reels together to make their color film. And what was good about Technicolor was it didn't need special equipment to play the film. So like Apple of yore, these companies had, well, you make film by our process, the cinemas are going to need our projectors to play the film and blah, blah, blah. Technicolor didn't need that. It was more of a freeing process. It was cumbersome on set. There were these things that they had to have to film it that other cameras didn't need. But yeah, Disney and kind of these films really pioneered the kind of advent of color cinema as we know it. And Technicolor didn't really stay around that long in the grand scheme of cinema, but it was amazing. And it always gives me a little flutter when you see that kind of that logo at the start of the film, and then you look in the credits and you see a color supervisor and you're like, that's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's also So it's funny, like this is a film I definitely found later. This is not a film that I like grew up watching or anything like that. This was a film that um, I watched, yeah, later in life as a film fan, and a cinema fan, and I just went, that's one I should see, like
Mm.
because I was looking at its place in cinema history, saying if I think I like cinema, then I think I need to watch this thing. So what I found interesting, and I'm not sure if you sort of found the same thing, was because my genres are action and adventure, and because I watched this film later after already being exposed to heaps of that genre, I was just finding, all of my favorite movies in this movie in various places. And like it was almost jarring sometimes to just be like, oh, that angle, oh, that set, oh, that, the when they're in the castle, and they're actually that doing all that sort of combat, or even just walking on the
Yeah.
huge staircase that doesn't have the railing. I'm like, that is a famous set piece, that has been so often replicated in other movies, that are trying deliberately now to reference this movie, so it was cool to kind of see it there, and see some of these like one liners being executed, which is a staple of the action movie genre in the modern sense, so and also just like it's fun. It's Robin Hood, it's a classic kind of adventure story. But did you find that as well when you watched it? You were like, I can see the fingerprints of this movie in so much stuff that I love that's modern,
This is like the fossil in Jurassic Park where they get the DNA. Like,
Yeah.
I did a bit of reading afterwards because I literally typed in movies influenced by this movie, and there was like, oh, they were definitely influenced in Star Wars with the lightsaber duels and choreo. Like there was like elements of that carried through, and because he was trying to make a serial and adventure cinema, and he was inspired by that. You look at any kind of even like a Pirates of the Caribbean, like going up on a rope, swinging across, that kind of those adventure tropes all started with like this and a couple more movies of this era, and it is just kind of this. Hollywood has ever since when they've made these movies been making love letters to this movie and a couple of others, and you can see it's always fun when you see an influence that is a loved influence, like a deliberate influence. But what we're seeing with this one, because so much time has passed, is an influence that is now second, third, and fourth hand, where people do it because it is expected of the genre, but they don't necessarily know where it's coming from anymore. And that's kind of what we're seeing with this. It's like, as I said, it's Dino DNA, baby. Like it's the beginning blocks, and we've added bits to it to make the dinosaur, but those beginning blocks are still there, and it's fascinating to see. The wildest thing about this, though, in my opinion, are the stunts. Because this was before, A, people cared about safety, and B, when like they had stage tips and tricks. They had gimmicks that they were used to doing from like carnivals and stage shows and productions like that. But when you're doing them in cinema and you're trying to outdo the last guy, like the stuff they're doing is just human ability. And it's nuts. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of repeated things like people jumping from trees. A lot of people jump from trees in this movie. And the thing is, the stars were doing most of their own stunts. I think the only thing Flynn didn't do was when he cut the rope and went up the portcullis. Because that you just need a parkour dude before parkour was a thing. And a little bit of the sword fighting. A very small part of the sword fighting. Everything else he did. And that just, it blew my mind. They actually shot people with arrows in this movie?
I was going to ask if you knew that, because it's like, and that's something where it's like, so yeah, what Ben's talking about is like, because there's so much archery in the film and people getting shot with arrows, they just shot people with arrows and they put armor underneath the actors' costumes.
So it was like a quilt padding, balsa wood so it would stick there, and then a metal backing so it didn't go through. And like they That's why there's a lot of gut shots in this movie.
It's just hilarious. It's just hilarious that they're like, yeah, we'll just shoot him. We'll just shoot him with an actual arrow, and like we'll put some safety quote unquote stuff there to make sure. I mean, what if you hit him in the head? They'd just be
They
dead.
paid them $150 extra to be shot with arrows. And do you know the same dude shot all the arrows?
Yeah, I heard that they got some kind of master archer, to come in and actually do the shooting.
His name was Howard Hill. And he was like the best of the best. He was Legolas. He'd won like 156 championships, which no one has ever beaten before. And it was before like composite bows or any of that sort of stuff. Like he was using like proper bows. And he also, even though they didn't use it in the film, apparently did the arrow split shot.
Yeah. Yeah. So look, I really enjoyed this movie. There's a few things that they do in the film that are, a little bit different. Like, for instance, you already sort of talked about the fact that in the movie they have Guy of Gisborne as like a massive character. The other thing which is interesting is that, Marion isn't really, for the first sort of half of the movie, she's kind of a bad guy, if you like. She's now, look, she's naive and she's been sort of tricked and lulled into a sense that that King John, if you like, or Regent John, is doing the right thing. But she sort of has to be convinced and persuaded and come around to Robin's side, which is not something that you usually see in modern adaptations. She's usually just an out and out sort of heroic kind of character.
She's a rebel from the start.
Yeah. And so, and then the other thing that is sort of interesting about this film as well is that they sort of have a couple of key sequences that really from this point onwards are in pretty much every Robin Hood film. Like that idea of him hiding in the tournament, is a touchstone moment, as is the idea that there will be a big banquet scene, in the Robin Hood film. And so both of those moments kind of stand out, and in pretty much every adaptation of Robin Hood, you're going to see both of those things at some point, and this was kind of the initial kind of, I guess, setup of those sort of conventions. But the other thing that is almost distracting is if you know, which I know you do, but if you know Robin Hood Men in Tights from the 90s, which is obviously this parody, farcical kind of take, the visual style of that film is so directly riffing this film, that it's almost distracting to then go back and watch this film. If you're used to, say, watching, I mean, look, I watch Men in Tights with some frequency because I think it's hilarious, but like, it's just sort of.
Yeah, Men in Tights is the kind of the plot and structure of Costner's Robin Hood, with just the visual stylings and costuming and a few like bit pieces from The Adventures of Robin Hood. And again, I think also it's brilliant. So two things that I liked in this film, and I actually was surprised by it. The modernization of the speech. The speech was of the time's vernacular, not of a period piece, which wasn't really common in this time. Like, they would usually just throw a thous and forsooths in there and all that sort of stuff. And I actually found out it's actually because of Hal B. Wallace. The original script had all of that in there, and he just said, no, get it out and rewrite it as we speak. And the people were really resistant because, well, that's not how you make this sort of film. He's like, well, I want people to understand the film. And they kind of made it. The other thing was, you kind of touched on it a little bit with Marion, the Saxon-Norman equality messaging in this film surprises me for its time. Like the whole, like, Robin very clearly going, I don't care if you're Saxon or Norman. If you need help, you get help. Like, this isn't a Saxon or Norman issue. This is a bad guy who's doing bad things. Because all the start of this movie is the whole thing like Saxon versus Norman, and the Normans are oppressing the Saxons and taking their land and their money. But yeah, it's this kind of weird, kind of political piece, really, in a film that it in an era where that didn't really belong, especially for equality and like everyone deserves the same sort of thing. Now, don't get me wrong, all those people are definitely men and white, but it still had that message.
Yeah. It is almost sort of surprising, again, when you look at sort of modern takes on the story. There's so much focus in this movie on, Norman versus Saxon, and that's usually just not even a thing in most Robin Hood stories. They
It's
literally
rich
just
and poor.
they just keep it to the macro, problem of King Richard versus his brother, King John or Regent John, however you want to call it. So Prince John. But yeah, it's another hallmark of the story, which after this one kind of falls away, much as you sort of say, so much of the stuff we kept from this version of the story. There are a couple of things that we never see again. In this version of the story, or not with the same emphasis anyway. So, look, I would say sort of it's been my mission a little bit to send us further and further back in time. Like I feel like one day you'll just, beat me to it and just be like, Tim, I've decided we're going
Nosferatu.
No, we can go further. The first feature length film was an Australian film called The Adventures of the Kelly Gang. I feel like one day you'll just be like, "Hey Tim, we're watching Adventures of the Kelly Gang." You can't
I'm pretty
go
sure
back any further.
we've seen that movie together at the Film Institute on a school excursion.
Yeah, I mean, look, and it's the only thing about that film, of course, is that it doesn't all exist anymore. So you
Big
can
chunks
see
missing.
most of it, like
Yeah.
Sorry,
something that blew my mind about this movie. Sorry, just quickly. They speeding up of footage to make action more exciting. Did you notice it? Like it was jarring. Like they're like the group action fights. They've obviously filmed them at normal speed, and they're just running the film faster. That's all they can really do in this, right? And it's this kind of like faster fight scenes, more frenetic pace, and that's how they're kind of amping up the excitement in the scene. It's such a weird technique to see when we look at modern cinema to this, right? Because like frame rates, weren't really anything here. Like they had a frame rate because of the way the technology worked, but yeah, it felt really odd in parts, jarring.
It's interesting because, if you look at action cinema, to this day, they're still playing with frame rates, and even in places where it doesn't look like they are. The a lot of the '80s sort of Hong Kong cinema, they do things like they jump frames, and pull out 2 or 3 frames on a hit or something like that to sell it a little bit more. And this is kind of, again, it's like the proto version of that, but they can't hide it half as well because all they can do is try and make it a bit more intense by speeding up the actual speed. And there's all these other artifacts in the frame which lead us to see that that's what's happening. So it is quite an interesting choice, and it's not one that hung around very long because it's so obvious in its execution.
They got better at it, right? As you said, like they developed new techniques because they would have been looking at it going, man, I wish we could do this without that.
Yeah. But also, again, like we're still early enough that you could kind of get away with that. Like, some of the cameras that they were using in the silent film era, which again was only like 10 years prior to this, were actually hand cranked, which meant that the frame rate was variable depending on how good the guy was at actually keeping a steady hand. So, so kind of like, and audiences would have noticed this. I'm not saying they didn't notice it, but it's like it was still more common in their sort of mindset and cinema going history to see
they wouldn't have cared.
Some frame rate stuff like that play out, so
well, the magic was what they were seeing. It wasn't in the perfection or what we think is the perfection of that sort of stuff now. It was what they were seeing then. It was like that was like I'm jealous in a way. Like that was genuine magic back then. Like not a lot of people had seen it. What they were still doing, they were still innovating. We're still innovating now, but we're so used to the innovation, we're so used to change that it's no longer magic for us. And I've got a bit of FOMO about that for sure.
It's also it's actually a very strange experience to watch a film this old, that has actually been lovingly restored several times, because what we're watching is so much cleaner than
Yeah.
the image that the audience would have seen, because projection technology was awful back then. So, these things that we're talking about, like even the vividness of the Technicolor was not as good for
No.
them as it is for us, or the noticeable frame rate effects weren't as noticeable for them because the projection quality was not as good. So it's sort of like, it's almost it's almost a weird experience to watch it in a better quality than it was intended for, because it means that things jump out to you a lot more that original audiences just like wouldn't have noticed as much.
No.
Like little things like hidden in the sides of frames that are production details or whatever, that they just would never have seen that, because the quality of what they were viewing was not as good as what we have now. So it's that weird kind of disconnect.
Yeah, look, genuinely, I think if you're a fan of cinema, if you're somebody who wants to understand movies more, this is a must watch. It is a 10 out of 10 watch. If you want to develop your cinema sense, if you want to develop your movie taste, this is something you have to watch. It's not necessarily something everybody's going to enjoy. As I said, if you've grown up on modern cinema, the pacing is going to be odd, the language is going to be odd, but the influence is just undeniable. Like this won 3 Academy Awards: Best Art Direction, Best Original Score, which actually the score, we haven't mentioned the score. This is such a classic score. If you listen to it, and you even listen to modern adventure and swashbuckling films, the themes are all still there. Yes, the orchestra and the quality and that is better or different, but the themes still carry through that were in these movies. And it also did win for Best Film Editing. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, what best film editing, like, what does that mean in 1938? It's hard to know
It's
what
like,
they're
man, they
looking
put
at.
it in one long strip and played it. That's wild.
Well,
So,
look, thank
yeah.
you for joining me on this crusade, if you like, pun intended, to the Adventures of Robin Hood. I'm curious as to what you've got for me, moving out of this point in time. So shall we leave Robin Hood behind, or not, depending on what you've got for me? And we'll hear what we're going to be watching next time.
So you've expressed multiple times that through this podcast, you're trying to take me on a journey through cinema, through things I haven't seen, through older movies and things like that, which is very selfless of you. You're trying to educate me and widen my horizons. I have selfishly been taking you through a journey of movies that made me, movies that shaped me, and movies that kind of like have really been a part of my life. And this is what I've done again. I've chosen a movie that has so intrinsically been a part of, let's say, my sense of humor. And I know that scares you. I know that immediately scares you, but I promise you it's not what you think. So I have often quoted to people that my sense of humor is made up of 4 things. Uh, Equal parts my mother and my father. They're some of the funniest people I know on this planet. They can make me laugh, and me making them laugh is my favorite thing in the world. Kevin Smith and his humor has definitely been a massive influence on me. And then there's this 4th movie, and this very movie specifically. And we've actually tangentially touched on it in this movie. It's a black and white film, and it's by a comedy legend. Do you think you know what it is?
I don't know. I'm like, as you were sort of listing off influences, I'm like, yes, that's you. Yes, that's you. That's you as well. And then you're like, there's this other one.
So he also made a movie called Robin Hood Men in Tights, which is great. But he also made my favorite comedy of all time, Young Frankenstein.
Young Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Okay. I have not seen that movie.
Yes. Yes.
And
There are,
I didn't know that was such an influence for you.
and I knew you didn't, because it's not like a sharing movie for most times. It's not like, hey, you're around at somebody's house, let's watch a funny movie. Oh, put on Young Frankenstein. It's not that sort of movie. But I watch this movie with my mother, and every single time we cry laughing. Every time. It is
Ah.
one of those magical films that you sometimes get to share with a person. And this one, I've watched it with my dad, and we laugh at the same things. It's that silly Mel Brooks humor. It's Gene Wilder. It's black and white. It's a play on a classic story, and it is just, I'm so excited to share this with you.
Well, I look forward to watching Young Frankenstein. I don't know what I thought you were going to say, but it was not that. So, so look, why don't you tell our dear listeners where they can find our quality product before we get ready to view Young Frankenstein for next time?
If you want to listen or watch anything we do, please do so. We'd love to hear from you. You can do it at YouTube at Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. You can find us on Spotify and iTunes, again, at Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. And if you want to see anything we kind of post or anything like that, we do so on Instagram, which is Jim_and_Ben. Please like, comment, subscribe. We'd really love to hear from you. I'd love to talk to you about me and you choosing a movie that we inflict on Jim. To do so, put it in the comments, reach out to us on Instagram. We just want to kind of have that interaction, know that people are listening, and we'd love to hear a movie that you'd want us to watch. So again, thank you so much, Jim, for letting us watch The Adventures of Robin Hood. I can't wait to share Young Frankenstein with you. It's been a good podcast. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye-bye.